Good morning. Go ahead and turn, if you will, to Matthew chapter 6. We'll be there in just a moment. Matthew chapter 6. We're seeing today a merging of what I've been doing on Sunday mornings and then what I've been doing on Sunday evenings. On Sunday mornings, a lot of the time, not all the time, but I'll preach on whatever the theme of the month is. And this month, that theme is the idea of purity of motives. The idea that not just what we do or what we think matters to God, but also why we do what we do and think what we think matters to God. That God cares about why we do things. On Sunday evenings, I have been preaching on the Sermon on the Mount. And we have just gotten through chapter 5. We're in chapter 6. And the reason that I am preaching this sermon this morning is this is typically a Sunday evening sermon. However, it very much speaks to the theme of the month, the idea of purity of motives. And we'll get into that. But it's also to give you an opportunity, if you're not here on Sunday evenings, to hear what we typically go over. And I'd invite you to think about coming, being here, part of this on Sunday evening, not because I'm the greatest preacher in the world, but because Jesus is the greatest preacher in the world. And we're going over one of his most famous sermon. And there's a lot to be gleaned from this. We've been spending sermon after sermon in this sermon, and we still got a lot left, and yet there's so much there for us to learn from what Jesus has said. So in Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 1, Jesus says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. So when you give to the poor, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be honored by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But when you give to the poor, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving will be in secret. And your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. When you pray, you are not to be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners, so that they may be seen by men. Truly I say to you that they have their reward in full. But you, when you pray, go into your inner room, close your door, and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you are praying, do not use meaningless repetition as the Gentiles do, for they suppose that they will be heard for their many words. So do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him." Now, stopping there for just a moment, Jesus has talked about two different things so far. He's talked about giving and praying, and we'll go over those in more detail. But in general, he's talking about doing things, the right things even, for the wrong reasons. And so we come back to the idea that we talked about last week. Jesus, in verses 9 through 15, goes over what is sometimes called the Lord's Prayer. That is going to be its own sermon that we will cover next sermon on the Sermon on the Mount. However, he then goes back in verse 16 to talking about what he talked about previously, and it's kind of an interesting thing that he does. It's almost a parenthetical. It's almost sandwiched right in the middle of his thoughts. He teaches us how to pray, and there's a lot of effectiveness in that. But we also want to look at verses 16 through 18 because they have to do with what we're talking about this morning. So verse 16 says, "Whenever you fast, do not put on a gloomy face as the hypocrites do, for they neglect their appearance, so that they will be noticed by men when they are fasting. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that your fasting will not be noticed by men, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." Jesus, in this section that we're looking over this morning, is talking about what I would call performative righteousness. These Pharisees, these hypocrites that he's talking about, the religious people of the day, they were doing the right things, but they were doing them for the wrong reasons. That is, they were doing them, Jesus says, to be seen by men. They were putting on a show. And though they were doing the right things in these cases, Jesus also calls them hypocrites, which points to the idea that yes, they're doing the right thing in front of people, but at other times they're not doing the right things and their hearts are not right with God. And so we want to talk about what Jesus has talked about, and we will split it up as he has somewhat split it up for us, in talking about giving and then praying and then fasting, and see what we can learn from what Jesus says this morning. So let's talk about giving first. Jesus says, when you give to the poor, do not sound like a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be honored by men. Truly I say to you that they have their reward in full. So Jesus gives us some things that we should not do. When we are giving, don't look for the praise of men. He says that in verse 1, beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. In verse 2, he says, when you give to the poor, don't sound a trumpet before you. Don't make a big show of it. Don't seek everyone's attention when you're doing that. We should not be doing these kinds of things, looking for the praise of men, looking for people to pat us on the back and say, look at you, how good you are, how righteous you are. Don't do that. But also Jesus says, when he's telling us what to do, he says, but when you give to the poor, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And one of the main sources that I've been using for my studies is a book called The Sermon on the Mount for Everyone by Mark Roberts. And I really loved what he pointed out by this. He said, when you are not letting your left hand know what your right hand is doing, essentially also you're not looking for praise from yourself. You're keeping it a secret from yourself, which of course we know that we cannot literally do. But if Jesus isn't meaning for us to take this literally, what's the point he's trying to get? I think it's this. That some people do the right thing to make themselves feel better as well. And that's just as wrong as looking for the praise from men. We have to be careful about that. Yes, we do get a good feeling from doing what is good, and in a sense, that can be righteous, that can be good. But we should not be doing good things simply to make ourselves feel better. That is not the motive behind what we do. And so whether we're looking for the praise from others and that makes us feel good, or whether we're simply looking to make ourselves feel good by doing these good deeds, that's the wrong thing. And Jesus says, don't do that. But Jesus also says some things that we should do. And maybe this can go unnoticed because we start talking about motives, but something that we should pay attention to is that Jesus says, give. Give to the poor. He doesn't say, you know what? Giving to the poor, you're doing it to be noticed by men, you're doing it for your own self-gratification, so you just shouldn't do it. Don't give to the poor. No, Jesus doesn't say that. Jesus says, give, and he gives some conditions behind it, and we'll get to those conditions. But let's not get lost in the conditions, the idea that we are to give to the poor. If you would turn to Proverbs chapter 19. Proverbs chapter 19. And verse 17. It says, one who is gracious to a poor man lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his good deed. You notice kind of the language is similar to what Jesus is saying here. He talks a lot about a man's reward. in this passage. A reward from God. And we'll get further deeper into that as the sermon goes along. But understand this, when we give to the poor, God will reward us. It's a good thing to do. Again, the reward is not necessarily why we do it. But we understand that God is well pleased by that, and God wants us to give. We should be generous in our heart. We should give to poor people. We should give to people who have need, and do it freely, and do it generously from the goodness of our heart, wanting to be pleasing and wanting to serve the Lord. That's why we do it. And I think sometimes, I know I can be this way, I don't know about you, but I think sometimes we can get so caught up in the other aspects of giving, whether we're doing it for the praise of men, wanting to be secretive about it, or, making sure that we're not getting a big head. We can get so caught up in doing it the wrong way and not wanting to do it the wrong way that we don't do it at all. And that should not be our takeaway from this verse or any other verse that gives a caveat on our motives. We should be aware of doing things the wrong way for the wrong reasons, but that doesn't stop us, that should not stop us from doing the right thing, from giving to the poor, from being generous in our heart and hospitable in our soul. But, that being noted that we should be giving in general, we also have to make note of the way to do it. Jesus says, "But when you give to the poor, do not let your left hand know what your right is doing." In other words, don't make it about you. "So that your giving will be in secret, and your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you." Now I want to talk about this idea of being in secrecy because Jesus mentions it every single time. Jesus is not saying that nobody should ever know any good thing that we do. And the reason I know that that's the case is because in just the previous chapter, Jesus says, "Let your light so shine before men that others will see your works and glorify the Father." And so what Jesus is saying here has to be reconciled with what he's just said, in a manner of speaking, minutes before. He just said, "Let your light so shine among men that they may see your good works and glorify the Father." He says you're a city set on a hill, that you should not be hiding your light. So Jesus, in one passage you're saying, don't hide your good deeds. In another passage, it sounds like you're saying, hide your good deeds. And again, it comes back to motives. You let your light shine so that they may glorify the Father. But, on the other hand, sometimes you need to be careful about showing your work so much because of wanting to do it for the praise of men and for making yourself feel good. And so maybe the idea is that when we are tempted to hide our good deeds, we should show them for the glory of the Father. And when we are tempted to promote our good deeds, we should tamp that down, again, for the glory of the Father. Everything is done in such a way that it brings glory to God, not to ourselves. And that's what Jesus means by this idea of being in secret. It's all about God sees it. Even if other people don't see it, you're doing it for God's glory and for service to Him. And God sees everything at all times, and so you're doing it in such a way that God is going to see it, God is going to reward you, and He is glorified. So let's talk about the next thing that Jesus talks about, and that's prayer. And once again, He gives us some things to not do, and then some things to do. Jesus says, don't put on a show when you're praying. When you pray, you are not to be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners, so that they may be seen by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. So Jesus says that prayer is not a performance. Don't put on a show when you're in prayer. Men, I'll speak to you specifically because we have an opportunity as men to pray publicly, to pray in the worship service. And we need to be careful. We need to listen to the words of Jesus here and understand that even though we're praying in public, which is something that Jesus himself did, Jesus is not saying in this section, don't pray in public. Jesus prayed in public. He in a sense, goes on to pray in public in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, pray then in this way. But when you're praying in public, it's not a show. It's not a performance. It's not about, hey, look at how eloquent I am. Or look how much scripture I can quote in this prayer. Or look at me and how I can turn a phrase. That's not what it's about. It's about offering a prayer to God, offering service, thanking Him for what He has done, praising Him for the God that He is and the qualities that He has. It's about petitioning Him to act on our behalf for the things that we have cares and concerns about. It's about asking and inviting His presence into this worship service and asking Him to continue to accept our worship. That's what public prayer is about. It's not about putting on a show. It's not about making other people impressed with how righteous or how wordy or whatever else we are. In that same vein, Jesus says in verse 7, don't pray thoughtlessly or vainly. He says, and when you are praying, do not use meaningless repetition as the Gentiles do, for they suppose that they will be heard for their many words. So do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. So the Gentiles, they would pray to their gods, who is not like the God of heaven at all, but gods who, they weren't sure whether their gods were going to hear them or not. And so they just pray over and over and over and use vain or meaningless repetition. And there are some today, religiously, who seem to have this mindset that the more you say something, the more likely God is going to hear you, or you have to say a prayer a certain amount of times in order for it to be effective. And Jesus says, don't do that. It's not about repeating yourself. It's not even about the words you say, in a sense, because even before you ask, God knows what you need. And so God is not impressed by how many times you say something or how much you say, because He already knows. It's not about the number of words you say. It's about the spirit in which you pray. I have heard some beautiful prayers, some very spiritual prayers that were quite short. And I've heard quite frankly, some very shallow prayers that were quite long. But the opposite is true as well. Now, Jesus is not saying that we cannot repeat ourselves in prayer. You can find prayers in the Bible where the same words are repeated. In fact, Jesus Himself repeated His words in the Garden of Gethsemane, where 3 times He said, Father, if it is your will, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Jesus repeated Himself in His prayer. But it's about the thought behind it. It's about not just vainly or doing it to be heard, but rather the spirit, the motive, that we are entreating God, that we are wanting, again, to glorify Him. And once again, we should not be so daunted by the ways not to pray that we don't pray at all. Because Jesus has a lot to say on prayer in this chapter. But there's another chapter that He says a lot about prayer, and that's Luke chapter 18. You can keep your marker in Matthew chapter 6. We'll be back. But Luke 18, Luke 18 and verse 1. We won't look at the parable after this, but I just want to make the point. It says in Luke 18 verse 1, "Now he was telling them a parable to show that at all times they ought to pray and not to lose heart." Jesus understood the power, the purpose, and the importance of prayer. And he's telling these people, he tells them one parable about a widow who is seeking justice, and he goes into telling another parable that we'll look at in just a moment. But he's emphasizing to them that they should pray at all times and not lose heart. We ought to be the same. We ought to pray at all times, not lose heart. Don't let people praying wrongly or the fear of praying wrongly keep you from a relationship with your God. Prayer is absolutely utmost importance to Christians and our relationship with God. And Jesus understood that, and Jesus taught that. But in this chapter in Luke 18, we actually see a contrast of two people praying that tells us a lot about the manner in which we are to pray and the motives behind why we pray. In Luke 18, starting in verse 9, "And he also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself, 'God, I thank you that I am not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I get.' But the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, 'God, be merciful to me, the sinner.' I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted." Now I want to make note, both of these people went up to the temple to pray. They were praying in public. And so what Jesus says here about praying and going and locking yourself in a closet and praying in secret, again, there's a purpose behind that. It's not that you should always pray in private and never pray in public, but rather, why are you praying? Is it to glorify God or to glorify self? So in this case, they're both praying in the temple publicly, which was something that was done. There was an hour of prayer, as we read about in Acts chapter 3 and 4. An hour of prayer in the temple. And the Pharisee goes up and he prays this prayer. Maybe he's hoping somebody hears him, because it sounds a lot like he's not really praying to God, but maybe praying to a crowd. "God, I thank you that I'm not like everybody else, that I'm righteous. I fast twice a week. I do all these great things. I give alms." By the way, you notice some things. He gives alms, he fasts. This sounds like Matthew chapter 6. And he says, "I thank you that I'm not like this tax collector." But standing a ways off, the tax collector is not concerned with what other people hear and what other people think about him. He's even unwilling to lift his eyes to heaven. He says, "God, be merciful to me, the sinner." And Jesus says the tax collector went away justified, the Pharisee did not. Why? Because they prayed. The tax collector prayed in such a way that emphasized his dependence upon God and sought to glorify God. That's what prayer is. Prayer is recognizing our dependence upon God. God already knows what we need, but He wants us to come anyway. He wants us to come to Him in prayer. Why? Because we need to realize how much we depend upon Him. The tax collector knew that. God, be merciful to me, the sinner. I need your mercy. I need your grace. The Pharisee said, "God, I'm doing pretty good. I don't really need anything. I thank you that I'm not like everybody else." when the hypocrites prayed in the street corners and in the synagogues, they wanted everybody else to see how good they were. When we pray in the right way, we want God to see and look upon and visit how destitute we are without Him. That's the difference. That's what Jesus is trying to get at. Finally, we come to verses 16 through 18, where it talks about fasting. And Jesus says, when you fast, there are some certain things that you ought not to do. Again, He comes back to this point of drawing attention to yourself. When you fast, don't draw attention to your piety. Don't draw attention to how great and how you're following the ceremonies so perfectly. Don't do that. So once again, we would emphasize, as Jesus has repeatedly emphasized, it's not about drawing attention to yourself. But I noticed something else here that I think is also important to note. He says in verse 16, don't neglect your appearance. In verse 17, when you fast, anoint your head, wash your face. In general, and I would say this applies to fasting as well, the point of fasting is not to neglect self-care, is not to neglect taking care of yourself. And I think there are some in this world, and we can fall prey to this kind of thinking too, that basically abasing myself, basically robbing myself of physical pleasures is service to God. And while it is true that sometimes when we are serving God and doing what is right, we are robbing ourselves of physical pleasures, let's not put them out of order. We serve God, and sometimes that does mean delaying pleasure or taking away a pleasure, foregoing the passing pleasure of sin, like it talks about in Hebrews 11 that Moses did. But robbing ourselves of the things that we enjoy in life just for the sake of doing it is not service to God. Over in Colossians 2. Colossians chapter 2, if you'll turn over there. In verse 18, Paul says, let no one keep defrauding you of your prize by delighting in self-abasement and the worship of the angels, taking a stand on visions he has seen and inflated without cause by his fleshly mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the entire body, being supplied and held together by the joints and ligaments, grows with a growth which is from God. If you have died with Christ to the elementary principles of the world, why, as if you were living in the world, do you submit yourself to such decrees such as, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, which all refer to things destined to perish with use, in accordance with the commandments and teachings of men. These are matters which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom, and self-made religion, and self-abasement, and severe treatment of the body, but are of no value against fleshly indulgence. Paul was dealing with some kind of doctrine, we don't know exactly what, but some kind of doctrine that emphasized in part this idea of self-abasement. That I'm going to forego certain pleasures or even certain necessities of life, and that makes me more righteous, that makes me more holy. And even when we come to fasting, which we'll talk more about in just a moment, even when we come to fasting, that's not what fasting is about. Fasting is not the idea that, I'm not going to eat food, that makes me more holy. That's not what fasting is about. And so I'd like to make the side point here, if you will, that we need to take care of our bodies. That we need to take care of this vessel that God has given us. And that robbing ourselves of certain things that we need, robbing ourselves of enjoyment of life, again, in and of itself, is not service to God. It's self-made religion, as Paul says here. In Ecclesiastes, there are several passages and several thoughts of the idea of God has given us things in this life to enjoy them and to use them wisely and to use them for His glory, but we can get enjoyment and pleasure out of life. And that's what God wants. And so these Pharisees, these hypocrites, they were neglecting their appearance. They were neglecting themselves so that they looked all haggard and they looked horrible, so that people would say, you must be fasting today. Look at how holy you are. Wow, you've lost 10 pounds. You look terrible. I guess that makes you more righteous. No. We are not made more righteous by neglect of ourselves. We are made righteous by being good stewards of what the body that God has given us. And so Jesus does say to do some things here. And again, He says fast. Now, you'll notice I put an asterisk by this. I want to share a quote with you. This is from Mark Roberts, the Sermon on the Mount for Everyone, about fasting. And he says, "We do well to notice that gathering, preparing, cooking, and eating food took up a tremendous amount of time in the biblical world. One way that they could carve out extra time needed to be closer to God would be to forgo eating for the day. And once we see that, it's fair to ask if that translates to a world where there's fast food restaurants on every corner, ready-made meals in our freezer, and a microwave in our kitchen." And the point he's making is this. Fasting in that day, the purpose of it was to bring yourself closer to God, to emphasize your dependence upon God by foregoing that, we all need food. But it was also to make time for God by putting away all the time needed to prepare food. And so when we come to fasting today, there are various opinions on this, on whether fasting is something that we should do. And I would say this. I would say that's up to your personal judgment. But recognize that the purpose of fasting is foregoing time-consuming things to give more time to God. It's to dedicate yourself to God, to fasting, and prayer often goes with it. If you decide that not eating is the best way to do that, then fast in that way. But I would suggest that there are other ways that we can quote-unquote fast that don't have anything to do with food, but rather setting aside things that are time-consuming or frivolous or taking up our time and replacing that with time with God. One such way would be a social media fast, right? We spend hours scrolling Facebook or scrolling Instagram or whatever. Hours sometimes. What if we cut that out and replaced it with time with God, even for a week? How would that do for fasting? Or maybe we have some kind of hobby, some kind of activity that takes up our time and we enjoy it. Maybe we cut that out for a while so that we can take some time to dedicate it to God. Fasting was oftentimes done in times of crisis, because it was an idea of recentering yourself on God, recentering your priorities. And so in times of crisis, maybe food is not the thing that we need to cut out. Maybe it is. But in times of crisis, where do we find ourselves time to spend more time with God? So in that, take time to dedicate yourself to God and to fully depend on Him. That's what we ought to be doing. Fasting is not about drawing attention to yourself or drawing attention to how righteous you are. Look at me, at what I'm doing. Nobody else does this. Everybody else says I'm crazy to do this, but I'm going to forego food and I'm going to forego taking care of myself because that makes me more holy. No. It's all about our relationship with God. It's all about realizing our dependence upon Him. So understanding that's what Jesus is getting at in this passage, I want to take a few minutes to make some applications, and then the lesson will be yours. Number one, we need to beware of hypocrisy. I want you to notice how many times Jesus says beware in this passage. It's quite a few times when He says beware, or He gives some kind of warning even. Don't do this. Beware of practicing your righteousness before men in verse 1. You need to beware of these things. And one thing is hypocrisy. We read Romans chapter 2 a moment ago. Let's turn back there for just a moment. Romans chapter 2. In verse 17, Paul says, "But if you bear the name Jew, and rely upon the law and boast in God, and know His will and approve the things that are essential, being instructed out of the law, and are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, a corrector of the foolish, a teacher of the immature, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and of the truth. You, therefore, who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that one shall not steal, do you steal? You who say that one should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, through your breaking the law, do you dishonor God?" Verse 24, "For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, just as it is written." Now, in the context what Paul is doing, he's talking to Jews and he's saying, you get onto the Gentiles for being lawbreakers and being horrible, and they are without excuse. Paul deals with that in Romans chapter 1. But you Jews, you are just as without an excuse because you are hypocrites. You delight in the law, and you say you have the law, and you say, hey, you have the knowledge, and yet, even though you're preaching, do not commit adultery, you yourselves are committing adultery. You abhor idols, and yet you rob temples. And He says, the name of God is blasphemed among you. But I want to take from that the idea of hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is awful, and it's something that us as the people of God can have today. This passage has application to us as being spiritual Israel. We have the law of God. We have the new covenant in Christ Jesus. But we need to beware of hypocrisy. We need to be aware of making our lives and even making coming to services a masquerade ball. I'm going to be honest with you. There have been times in my life where I have felt like coming to worship services, coming to worship at church has been a masquerade ball. A masquerade ball being that everybody comes up and they're dressed up, and at a masquerade ball you wear a mask and you basically get to pretend to be another person for the length of that ball, that dinner, that all that goes with it. And sometimes, if we're not careful, that's what coming to worship services can be about. We put on our righteous face and we're engaged in worship, at least it looks that way, and we're putting on a show. We put on our Sunday best and we come out and we show everybody, hey, look, I'm doing okay, I'm righteous. And then we go home, and then the week happens and we're using foul language. We're treating our spouses, or treating our children, or treating our fellow neighbors horribly. We're lying. We're dishonest. We're lazy. We're not working hard for the Lord or whatever else. And all those things. And that's the hypocrisy that is being talked about here. That's the hypocrisy that Jesus was talking about in Matthew chapter 6. When they're in the streets, on the corners, or when they're in the synagogues, they're putting on their righteous face. But that wasn't who they were all the time. We need to be careful that we're not just putting on our righteous face when we come here. We need to be righteous and holy all the time. Every single day. The Pharisees, when you look at them, they were phonier than a $3 bill. They had the appearance maybe of righteousness, but inwardly not so. Don't be like them. Number 2, we need to be aware of glorifying ourselves. I found this passage interesting over in Zechariah chapter 1. It's an interesting passage because it's the children of Israel after they have come back from captivity. And they have a question for God. In Zechariah chapter 7 and verse 1. In the 4th year of King Darius, the word of the Lord came to Zechariah on the 4th day of the 9th month, which is Kislev. Now the town of Bethel had sent Sharezer and Regemelech and their men to seek the favor of the Lord. Speaking to the priests who belonged to the house of the Lord of hosts, and to the prophets, saying, Shall I weep in the 5th month and abstain, as I have done these many years? Then the word of the Lord of the hosts came to me, saying, Say to all the people of the land and to the priests, when you fasted and mourned in the 5th and 7th months, these 70 years, was it actually for me that you fasted? When you eat and drink, do you not eat for yourselves, and do you not drink for yourselves? Are not these the word which the Lord proclaimed by the former prophets when Jerusalem was inhabited and prosperous along with its cities around it, and the Negeb and the foothills were inhabited? They come to God and they say, should we continue to weep? Should we continue to fast? And God comes back and He says, was it for me that you did those things in the first place? And He says, when you eat and drink, is that not for yourselves? I think the point, what He's saying is, you didn't do those things for me. You did those for you. You did those for the sake of making yourself feel better and glorifying yourself. This is an important point. Service to God is not primarily to make us feel better about ourselves. And we live in a day and age, especially with all the therapy and everything that goes on, where we're told you need to feel better about yourself. And therapy is designed to make you feel better about yourself in a lot of cases. And service to God is not primarily about that. It can give you a sense of self-worth, and eventually it will make you feel better about yourself. But in some cases, in a lot of cases, service to God actually makes you feel worse about yourself, and it's supposed to, in a sense. Because if we feel good about ourselves, then we don't need God. If we're glorifying ourselves like the Pharisee was in Luke 18, then why would I need God? I feel good about myself. I'm my own best self. Instead, the gospel tells us, yes, we ought to feel bad about ourselves. We ought to mourn over our sin. We ought to realize that we are dependent upon God. And once we realize our worth in God, then we see the true sense of self. Then we can feel, if you want to put it this way, better about ourselves when we are in the Lord. Because we're actually putting our hope in Him, not in ourselves. if we seek to glorify ourselves, if we, even like these Israelites, go through worship, go through service to God, looking to make ourselves feel better, then don't be surprised when life feels empty. Because life does not consist of our own glory, of our own self-worth. Life consists of God and Him filling us up. Finally, I would say to you, beware of useless religion. You notice what Jesus says back in Matthew chapter 6? That first statement, which is really kind of a summary statement of the section. He says, beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. In other words, if you're practicing righteousness to be noticed by men or any other motive that does not ring true to glorifying God, then you have no reward. Your religion is useless. We got to be careful of that. Why would we want to come here? Why would we want to do the things that we do if at the end of the day it's useless and it serves no return, that we have no reward from our Father in heaven? And indeed, there are a lot of different ways that our religion can be made useless. For the sake of time, we won't turn here, but James chapter 1 and verse 26 says that if you do not tame your tongue, if you think you have good religion and that you think you're religious, but you don't bridle your tongue, your religion is useless, serves no value to you. But if you turn over to Amos chapter 5, consider the message of Amos to the people of Israel in that day. And truly not the message of Amos, but rather the message of the Lord. In Amos chapter 5 and verse 21, God says to the people of Israel, I reject your festivals, nor do I delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer up to me burnt offerings and your grain offerings, I will not accept them. And I will not even look at the peace offerings of your fatlings. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not even listen to the sound of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. God says to the people of Israel, you're worshiping me, but I hate it. I want you to stop it because it's useless. Why was it useless? Because they were hypocrites. They were offering service to God, but they were not truly righteous in their hearts. And so whether it's hypocrisy, that we're offering service to God, but we're not living a life that is in accordance with His will, or whether it's we're worshiping because we want to glorify ourselves, we're doing righteous things because we want to glorify ourselves or have the praise of men, or whatever else, our religion can be made useless. Our service to God can be rendered useless because of how we are. And do we want what we do to not matter? Consider that for some people, maybe even us, it would be better to not show up to worship at all, not until our heart is right with God. And that's a tough thing to say it'd be better for us to not show up to worship at all. And I'm not saying don't show up to worship. What I'm really saying is show up to worship with the right heart before God, because otherwise it is useless. Otherwise it is vain. And that's something for all of us to think about. So if you would open up your songbooks and open to the Song of Invitation. Question I'd have for you as we close is, from whom do you want your reward? That's something Jesus focuses on in this chapter. From whom do you want your reward? If you want it from men, fine. Go do it and get your praise from men. You'll have your reward in full. But if you recognize that that's emptiness, that that's vanity, and that there is a better reward, if you want your reward from God, then serve Him in the right way with the right motives, wanting to glorify Him, recognizing your dependence upon Him, giving Him your whole heart rather than just a face, a mask that you put on every once in a while. If you serve God with your whole heart and with the right motives, then you will receive a reward from Him. He will reward you. He will glorify you. But only if you glorify Him first. So this morning, if you need to give your life to Christ by putting Him on in baptism, or if you need to make correction in your life, you have this opportunity. Won't you come while we stand and sing?